You ready?
Rock and roll.
All right, here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest, Amrita Subramanian. Amrita, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much. It is a thrill and a joy to be here. And hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're listening into Guy. It is a delight that I get to have a conversation and share the space with Guy. Thank you, Guy.
I appreciate that. So Amrita has dedicated her career to helping organizations thrive in the midst of crisis. She's a trailblazer in the field of post-disruptive growth as a faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania and a lecturer at the Wharton School of Business. As an author, speaker, and executive coach, Amrita is on a mission to reach the masses with her message of intentional growth and hope. Amrita's life has been shaped by continuous growth from trauma. As a little child, she was abandoned in a convent to grow up with other children like her. The trauma and abuse she endured resulted in selective mutism until she was 11, among other things. Today, she can see how painful episodes throughout her life taught her to grow and now fuels her passion to help others. All right, Amrita. Before we get going here, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are now.
Thank you, Guy. So I share the planet with you, and I share the sentiment of the miracle of being born, as painful and sobering as it is to realize that one has to travel so many hurdles to reach this point. I was born to parents of Indian descent, and right now I am present in lovely Philly. It's a gorgeous day, and a week before Thanksgiving. What a perfect time to think of how we grow beyond pain.
I have fond memories of Philadelphia. I used to live there. I went to school there. Have you been there for a while?
Yes, almost 7 years, but it's a
Okay.
big, small town. You know, you have to be 700 years to actually become a Philadelphian.
Yeah. It's a cool little town.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's dive into this. So, how did you get to this position? Obviously, I read your bio, but take us to what has compelled you, inspired you, and propelled you to do what you're doing.
Well, for that, we might need approximately 40 hours to be gentle, but I'm very respectful of the attention that we're getting today. So I will say this. From a lens of someone who works, and my work is a big part of my identity, there was a time that I was in a very senior position in one of my corporate roles. And I'm just mentioning one incident where there was a massive instance of organizational betrayal. Consider it as a massive some trillions of dollars money laundered. And one of the things we had to do is to fire people, 3,000. And in fact, in that year, I'm talking of 2010, which was the last crisis versus this crisis, I was a part of the organization where several 100,000 people across the world were let go of. And today we are seeing the reverse phenomena with the reverse resignation taking place, but that's a separate conversation. My journey with growing beyond pain started when I first discovered that I was not wanted. And I had no idea there are words for it. And like you said, the silence in my life and the silence in my world, growing up as a child, a very rough childhood, getting to understand that I'm brown and that there is a gender involved, working with men and going through the same trouble of sexual harassment, not just at work, but also in personal life, feeling these shattering events after event and having this unspeakable void inside where I'm screaming inside my head, and I'm an intelligent person. I'm screaming with how badly I'm broken. And, you know, no amount of therapy can put to place the justification of this. And I constantly figured that, you know, we all have our internal GPSs. My GPS was very confused. I was an adult, I'm intelligent, I'm fair, I'm competent. And yet the abysmal shackling in my mind, the psychological posture inside, the emotional posture inside, would always keep me silent in a muted kind of a way. My frustration was how powerful I was and how powerless at the same time. The helplessness on the inside was so frustrating that I could not wait to find out whether it was from my therapist, whether it was from books, whether it was from wisdom of the world, the mythology, the religion, as to there must be a way out of this. Pain cannot be an end in itself. There must be something beyond. And so 2017, I came across this field called post-traumatic growth.
Let me just interrupt you just briefly, if I may. So you said you were talking about the pain of being unwanted. When did you realize that was your story, or part, or what you were had been experiencing? How old were you?
3.
3 years old. Okay. And as a result, you were did not speak.
Um, the, when you are 3, you don't understand what you're understanding, but there is an intuited sense from those around you. And then you grow up a little more, then you're 7 years old, and you see children around you who are like you. In the mirror of their void that you see on the faces of children, you begin to see your face, because when I grew up in the convent, there were no mirrors. I didn't know how I looked like. So imagine growing up, not knowing that you have a face, that this face is special, that this face is wanted and loved and cherished. And you are hoping that you matter. And then you learn with kids around you who sometimes got home, sometimes they didn't. You learn as a child very quickly that sometimes you are just a wilderness in the world, and there is no one to call you their own. The definition changes, but for me, the choice was very simple. I saw many kids who were like me curl up and die, if not physically, then emotionally. And the choice for me was, do I choose that because there is no one to tell me I'm worthy enough to be alive? Or do I make that choice for myself? That is a profound choice that a child has to make. That is an unfair choice. But a child doesn't know that, whether it's profound or it's unfair. The child simply knows, like a seed knows its power, that I have to grow. I have to somehow persist. Even if there is no answer at the end of the day. And I don't suppose as a child you have anything more than your imagination. To believe, to persist, that there might be a reality that is better than this reality that you have to chew and stay with. Thank
At
you for
11,
asking that.
you're welcome, and thank you for sharing. What happened at 11 such that you began to speak?
It was a moment in the choir. It was a moment in the church, and I think it was a wedding, and all the kids were there. I was there in my school uniform, and I had really difficult time being in public presence at all. I mean, I was very, very scared, and mostly it was just my burden of shame. And I remember they pick up the book in the pews, and we were singing Amazing Grace. And Sister Josephine was standing next to me. She's like Titanic, big cheeks coming out of this. And she was one of the kindest soul and a speech therapist back in the convent. And she looked at me and she kept saying, Amrita, child, you can fake it. Nobody's listening in the church. Nobody really listens how badly you're singing. So you just, open your mouth wide and you keep pretending. And I tried to get sounds out of my voice, which right now might at best sound like croaking and groaning. But those were the first sounds out of me. And that began the phenomena of understanding that this musical apparatus is not just a default apparatus, it is a psychological metronome for me. And that's where it began. I learned to speak as one would learn a new language of sound. So sound is music for me, and that's how I learned. Sister Josephine is what I credit. But in that day on the church was the first time in faking the sound to Amazing Grace. I remember that. It remains one of my closest hymns, but that's what happened. My first faking sound came out in a church.
What an incredible story. So, I mean, like you said, there's so much to talk about, and I would be very interested to find out. I mean, that experience of being mute, I know nothing about. I can't even imagine what that would be like, but I would guess that how maybe that has impacted and influenced and even inspired the trajectory of your life.
How astute of you to consider that, and what levels of humility you must have to ask that question. You don't know when you're mute anything except that you're silent, and that silence is your only reality. Selective mutism is a very common symptom for people who go through trauma, and that is because you just have no physiological way of expressing the endless scream on the inside.
Mm.
It is as an adult and in retrospect, as I reconstructed my life and its history, when I turned my face from towards what I was in denial of, is when I saw how I dealt with selective mutism. I had buried that memory. You just push on, you know, in the corporate world, there is no place for you to be vulnerable. But as a human being, those were facets that I needed to confront. And, you know, while we have that tension of confrontation, one of the things is, I was wrong. I thought I had to confront my demons. It's not that. We think of past as something dark, but it wasn't that. I was being shaped into the person I was becoming. I did not have the maturity and the wisdom to see it, but in my naivete, here's what I knew. I knew that this was not personal. I knew my pain was meant for something incomprehensible as it was to me. I also knew, because I knew sign language, that there is a method to speak. However, one of the things that the world's cruelty and sandpapering with this impatience, you know, we're very impatient with people who have different abilities than what we do, is that the world didn't understand that those of us who have something taken away from us, our neurological prowess overcompensates. So what I couldn't speak, I could see, I could hear. My perception went through the roof. And one of the things that happens, and this is a well-known aspect in research, is that children who have to watch out for predatory behavior have natural astuteness and awareness. And I suppose today I utilize that for compassionate diagnosis of what's going on. Sometimes, you know, we become very cruel and cold in our intellectual laser focus, and we forget that what we are dealing with is this warmth called human being. I understood in my muteness that I used to remember one act of kindness and hold on to it for 365,000 moments in a year when I would not have kindness. So receiving something in that moment was like a drop of water in an ocean of poison. One has to understand that the impatience of the world is the first lesson that is taught to those with, say, my kind of history or different history of unspeakable pain. And that became my inspiration eventually. But I can't say that, you know, that I had a design and I had a storyboard and I had a monk who sold the Ferrari kind of a story. You know, no such arrogance. It was a very slow, a very real shedding of the skin, and gradually finding out that the 3-year-old in me had more power, more resilience, more grace, because of which this 41-year-old me is able to nurture the pain that the 3-year-old had gone and change that story, to revise that story. So in so many ways, I'm very grateful for the pain. I wouldn't trade it, and I wouldn't give it to anyone else. It was mine to bear, and I have. But I also understand that this is now in the service of, and I don't have enough life left. Frankly, I don't have enough life left for what I need to do. But your question is astute. There are events in our childhood that clear the path for the destiny, but you just don't have. You're so innocent. You don't understand that this might be a very fiercely gentle way of destiny teaching you what you're about to become.
Amrita, was there a point where this did become conscious and you said to yourself, you know, I realize what's going on, what I have experienced. I want to or need to do this or this or this, or work in this sector or help in this way?
With the psychological maturity around 30, early 30s, is when I became very aware of the paradox. I was very successful on the outside, you know, all the metrics of 30 under 30, you know, all the metrics met. And at the inside, when I would look in the mirror, I could find who I was. I couldn't recognize. And it was baffling to me. I'm a very, very, I consider myself to be a very sensitive, very perceptive kind of a human being. And I couldn't reconcile this outwardness versus the void on the inwardness. It's almost as if the outside me was so far from the one on the inside. And that became the spurning moment when I started asking myself, what's going on? And I had a few incidents in my life that brought me, if you will, the shattering of my assumption. There were a few incidents involving close brushes with death. And death has a funny way of stroking the truth within your life. And, you know, considering that in front of me, I had to sit down and say, if anyone can die at any time, what am I doing? And that's as far as I can go in telling you that it was a very conscious decision, which is why it was a main inflection point. And in the last 7 years, I have not planned any of this, guys. So do not at any point of time let me say that, oh, I was premeditated, brilliant. No, no, no. I think it was serendipity. And as I started listening to the things that I must do, I must tell you that it was most excruciatingly humiliating to become aware that the choices that the outward self had made in terms of friends and relationships were so shallow and void. And you have to realize that, right? That there are things you do in the theater of being liked and approval junkies. And then when you start listening to the inside, you start making some real choices, which means you have to shed skin and shed that world. And you have to face the glare and the gaze of the world, which shames you into trying to conform to the puppet self that you were before. The loss of that was the best kind of loss, but it's also a very hard loss to swallow. And as my life in the United States, as I started looking, I came here as a student, did not come here wearing the badge of my previous, I'm a senior executive, European bank, I know all of this jazz. I came here as a student, I wouldn't speak about my past. Started therapy, and I started studying about, you know, initially it was a very intellectual stance, you know, dry intellectual. I want to study about corruption, I want to study about power. And while I was getting closer and closer to the bone, when I hit post-traumatic growth, it just coincided with my healing through the therapy and the knowledge, that cross-function. And I just figured out, dang it, this is the reason I'm here. This is what I want to do. And it changed my choices of career, and it changed everything that I was planning for my future.
Why did you go to therapy? Why did you start therapy?
I was tired of the lies I was telling myself. I was tired of how brilliant I was at lying myself. I was amazed at what I had made myself believe. And I needed to really find out who I am and who's this person. The world had taught me to be charming on demand. And I wanted to be honest with myself. And I didn't find the right therapist initially. That too is a quest. And eventually when I did, it was the beginning of a conversation with myself, conversation with my history, and understanding that you can't work this for all your life. You can't hide behind therapy all your life. There is therapy, and then there is living. And there is a fact that there is a practicality to the business of living. All of this were the outcomes, but I understood that each moment I have to process who I am, but I don't have to suffer and make others suffer for the process of my healing. You know, those were some of the things that happened, but the point as to why I needed to go to therapy is I was just excellent at making myself believe my deceptions, and I couldn't believe how well I had fallen into my own trap. I mean, the cleverer you are, you know, the fiercer those traps are. It's very good at it.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. So in the bio, I read that, or, you know, we shared that you're on a mission. I mean, obviously anyone listening to this can hear your passion. You're on a mission to help the masses understand what the importance of post-traumatic growth and hope. Talk to us about that.
For all of you listening, and Guy, thank you for creating this moment. We all understand pain, and we all understand that there is an unequal relationship between pain and its expression. We understand that we have a different relationship. We are taught that, we're socialized into that. We understand that trauma, as we understand, is a deep woundedness. That's the popular definition. But another definition of trauma in German is Traum, which means a daydream. So when you reframe the experience of pain, just as you would a daydream, as shaping daydream, you begin to see that this pain gives you choices. Most of us get so engaged in that experience of pain that we can never look up and see it is opening up a whole new realm of choices, because clearly pain is a moment to pause. That's what it does. It forces you to stop, whether it's physical pain, it's psychological pain. But what happens is we engage with that pain as an end in itself. But post-traumatic growth, the whole precept is that adversity, a difficulty, what shatters your world or shatters whatever you perceive reality to be, is a moment when you then become teachable. You had an old GPS of how the world was. Suddenly it crashes. What do you have to do? Software upgrade. You upgrade it. But that upgrading is not just downloading and installing as it happens to our smartphones. Not somebody, nobody else codes it for us. You have to sit and code your growth. I chose the path of therapy. I chose the path of community work. I chose the path of ruminative reflections. I did all of that. I now know that those were traces. In that moment, I didn't. But studying this field, here's what I would say. Pain helps us see choices for growth, but it is not guaranteed that all of us will grow. The idea that we grow from pain is one of the most ancient ones. It is there in organized faith, in the folklore, in the stories, the morals of the stories. You always grow beyond suffering and pain. But that is scientifically thorny, because we have now seen that trauma does not always lead to growth. Because if you now look at it as a continuum, and this is for all the audience, imagine drawing a line. On one end of it is the dis-ease of it, where you're not at ease. And at its most extreme, where we need urgent and special attention, sometimes lifelong, is called post-traumatic stress disorder. That's this end of it. And with the pandemic in sight, the number has increased globally and in the United States by almost 2 to 3%. So now it's 11 to 17%, with women and people of color being more disproportionately vulnerable to this end. So now that's 7 to 18%, which means there's the rest of the continuum, which is of growth. The world is very focused on this so far. It's a notorious, celebrated end of it. There is pharmaceuticals, there is veterans, there is plenty of funding and government attention, not just in the United States, it's all over the world. But when you look at the rest of it, the question is, what about the rest of us who are not here, who are growing, who have made those choices? We may not be astutely conscious, as you said, Guy, of those choices we've made. We may not even be able to articulate to ourselves that I have grown. But we have this awareness that we did not succumb to this. Now, we all have different methods of interacting with how we grow. But that is the next part of our conversation. I'm going to pause after I say this. Growing beyond pain is a path fueled and filled with choices. But most of us are unable to even be aware that we have the permission to make that choice. That is what this field is about. Most of us say we hope to grow, but I would say this, hope is not a strategy. But this becomes tangible, and it becomes a strategy when you start understanding that your pain has afforded you an inflection point in the very myth of what you said was the reality of your life.
Right. Yeah, I love that idea of making even a distinction between choice and hope. I mean, passive and active, the difference. So on a practical level, is this what you're teaching at University of Pennsylvania?
So at University of Pennsylvania, I am beginning to offer this to students I should say participants, who are mostly CEOs, senior leaders, managers, etc., who want to look at it from a post-disruptive lens. And this is applicable to both the concept of any intentional or unintentional change to the concept of how do we go beyond crisis. So I've been offering this as a lens to post-crisis growth. This is what I teach. This is also what I coach in. This is also what I am working with organizations to scale up, because in the pandemic and even before pandemic, all of these resignation waves, the burnout of the system, the massive anxiety that the whole world is creaking in, these were all there. It just became very loud when everything went silent in COVID. So I will pause there, but yes, that is something that I am teaching.
So for the person listening to this, and we have obviously therapists listening to this, people who've experienced trauma, people who are both, right? Therapists who've experienced trauma,
Yes.
coaches, etc. For the person listening to this, Amrita, who is hearing you say, you know what, hope is great, but it's not really a strategy. What do you and if they're hearing that, because I could imagine, because a lot of times in this field, you know, you have to have hope. There's hope. Be hopeful.
God, Guy, I couldn't have said and agreed better to that, because um, it has been a personal quest, if you will, for me. And it is a joy that I'm speaking to those who are familiar with the braille of how this feels. And if you are blessed enough to have not felt that, but you love someone who has, then I think a way to look at it is there is no grammar that is universally applicable to how hope translates on the inside. But there is a universal way we can see it. We see it through choices. A person who hopes for a better reality will make choices in that direction, because life, if you will, is a forward movement, as we understand, and time moves forward on Earth, as opposed to choices which perpetuate a negative spiral. Look, we will grow. Whether we grow in a twisted internal way, whether we grow in a massive spiral outside, and those are just extremities of it. We are inevitably growing. The question is, are you noticing the choices you're making day to day, micro moments, hone in? What is happening in your mind, what is happening in your heart? And in fact, how about this? Keep a GPS in front of you. And if you're thinking of a GPS, I think of it as a triangle. If you're seeing it on the video, you can see me. There's a triangle, and these 3 points have 3 words to it. The first one is self. Are you making choices pertaining to yourself that move you forward or keep you stuck? In fact, beat you down. Are you harsh to yourself? What are you doing? That's an easy way to say, I am abysmally hard on myself. Well, there you have the choices, conscious. Or I'm making choices that really enhance who I am and amplify the parts of me that are truly blooming and blossoming. So that's the relationship with self. Second is also relationship in my relational others. The microcosm of, say, as my partner, as my best friend, as my colleague, as someone I trust, or even someone who I have an adversarial relationship with, you know, attachment versus aversion. What choices am I making about that? Am I amplifying my freedom in the attachment, in the relationships where I get nurturing love, or do I destroy it? What am I doing? What are these patterns? Because we all know our patterns. We may choose to be blind to it, but we have an innate sense that we are participating and perpetuating our reality. So that is a great place to pay attention to. And of course, a great interview to have with those who love you and those who do not, to ask, how do I help this aversion or attachment? And the third bit, and this is where I will pause after this, is to say, what do you understand about your place in the world? Is there meaning? Is there purpose? Because when our worlds get shattered, and I equate it to an internal ecological disaster, whether we are attacked by someone, whatever be the point of trauma, nature, man, mechanics, fate, hand of God, what happens is the shattering of our internal assumption or GPS does 3 things. We stop believing that the world is fair. We stop believing that life is meaningful. And we stop believing that I am worth good things, good love, good affection, goodness. So when we, going back to the question you asked, the practical part of it, ask yourself, when you make the choices that you do, whether it's self, others, and the world, does it fulfill the fulfilling prophecy of the life being blessed? And it is not about being Pollyanna, but in the equilibrium of understanding that there is unfairness, and yet there is a place for you and your life for it to prosper.
Wow. Amrita, this is heavy. this is, I mean, it's so multi-layered and complex, and at the same time, inspiring. I mean, you're asking people to, and inviting them to really be aware of the moment to moment kind of, unfolding of their lives, as John Kabat-Zinn says, look, I got to have you back. I'd love to have you, because it's clear there's so much to talk about, and you are a force. You're a force. I'm so glad I have you on this podcast. What's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
For folks, those who are not seeing, I'm absolutely blushing red. Guy is just so gracious, and thank you for that. A great way to stay in touch with me is LinkedIn. And also you could go and visit the website and participate in this study, growbeyondpain.com, which has most of my work. I'm sort of collating a common place for all that people can do and follow the work. And I would love to hear perspectives on people. This is what people do. People listen to podcasts or my interviews and my posts, and they come back to me with real data. So if you go to growbeyondpain.com and take a short survey, that's a great way to connect and have a one-on-one conversation.
Awesome. Before you go, I'm going to hold you to one book recommendation, anything, whether, topically related or anything else you've been reading that's been inspiring to you.
Well, I would offer a key, no matter where you are in your journey of growth. This book was written by Janet Bullman. It's called Shattered Assumptions. Read it with a gracious heart, and you might find more answers than you knew to even ask questions for.
Shattered Assumptions. Awesome.
Assumptions.
Amrita, it was a pleasure meeting you, and I'm so thankful that I had you on here. Again, this is awesome. This is why I do this. I get to talk to people like you. Seriously, this is what makes an impact on people, and I love it.
Thank you so much, Guy, because when you create conversations as these, we create freedom in places where freedom is unheard of, and that's the beginning of choice. Thank you for this, Guy. Thank you for doing this.
You're welcome. Take care.
Take care.